You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Alongside some of the biggest names in property, we'll be delving into topics such as
why the market is pushing net zero carbon faster than legislation.
Is renovation and retrofitting better for the planet than new construction?
How can we balance sustainability concerns with profit margins?
And much, much more.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Place Northwest podcast COP26 series. I'm Julia Hatmaker, Deputy Editor at Place Northwest, and as we come up on the UN's Climate Change Conference, you're going to start hearing people talk a lot about green infrastructure. It's viewed as one of the great ways to make a scheme more sustainable and to help the UK meet its goal to be net zero by 2050. But what are the best practices surrounding green infrastructure? That's what we'll be talking about today, looking at what individual developers can be doing as well as local authorities. Joining me are some green infrastructure geniuses, Lucy Wallwork and Alex Burton with LUC. LUC is an award-winning environmental consultancy providing planning, impact assessment, landscape design, ecology, and geospatial services to a wide range of public and private sector clients. With a track record spanning 55 years and a team of more than 200 skilled professionals, LUC is united by a determination to achieve sustainable development on behalf of their clients. With the climate change emergency in mind, LUC ensures that all its work promotes climate change mitigation and resilience. Lucy, Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Hi, Julia.
Yeah, feeling good today? Feeling good?
Feeling great.
Yeah, doing okay.
All right, good to hear that. So I think first things first, let's just define some terms here. Lucy, what is green infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I mean, it's a funny term, isn't it? I guess we've not always used the word green infrastructure. I mean, it sort of sits at the heart of what we do and have been doing right since the 1960s, but it's maybe only come up as a term a little bit more recently. So it's sometimes slightly misunderstood. I mean, basically what it refers to is a network, and the network's a really important bit of green and blue spaces and assets that lie between our cities, towns and villages, and also sort of thread through them. So the blue is really important. We often talk about green and blue infrastructure because it takes in river corridors as well and that sort of thing. And I mean, I guess the key thing is that it's not just about parks or about trees. It's a much wider range of assets than people might always think about. So things like woodland, rain gardens, which you can come back to, wildflower meadows, green walls, green roofs in kind of particularly more urban areas, greenways for walking, cycling and wheeling. There's kind of a whole range of things. And I guess the really key thing about it is firstly that it's a network. So these things really only work if they connect together and act as a whole network. And the thing that makes it so valuable and so important when we're talking about climate change, but also a range of other kind of challenges that we face, is that it's a term that we use quite often that is multifunctionality, that's jargon alert. But essentially that means that one asset, whether it's woodland, for example, can provide a range of functions. So that might be as a carbon store. So that's really important in the climate change context for drawing down carbon, but it's also a really important recreational asset for kind of health and well-being. So somewhere to kind of walk and cycle and exercise. It's really important for biodiversity as well. But also things like, natural play. We do a lot of work on natural play within LUC. That's a really, really key asset that provides space to play. And also just kind of a sense of place. And that's got a really, really important function that maybe we'll come back to as part of placemaking. It has a really important role. So it's not just about climate change, it's about climate change and a range of other things that it can sort of deal with all at the same time, really.
All right, I have to ask you, because you mentioned this term natural play, which I'm actually not very familiar with. So what is natural play?
Well, I'm not one of the designers who works specifically on natural play, but essentially kind of if you look at the sort of play spaces that are that generally often get rolled out traditionally as part of development, sort of a bit of a plastic slide and a plastic swing, they're not particularly kind of sensory rich, nature rich environments. And sort of building on a lot of the research that talks about our need to kind of interact with nature at an early age and to provide opportunities for imaginative play. There's some really good work going on by ourselves and others in producing these really kind of imaginative natural play spaces that use natural materials, that are set in natural settings, and can provide a really important part of wider landscapes that helps children basically interact with nature in a more imaginative way.
Okay, so I mean that is an interesting aspect of things, and you've touched on like rain gardens and things like that. So let's kind of zoom in, think small. I'm a developer. I've got one site. I want to bring in some green infrastructure elements. What should I be doing? Alex, I'm gonna ask you to take lead on this one.
I suppose the three big things really you can do are rain gardens, green roofs, and trees. So yeah, that's sort of the three staples really that you can really enhance your site in terms of green infrastructure. So to start with the first one, so a rain garden, that's really just a sustainable drainage system. So your sud system. However, instead of a bog standard retention or detention basin, it's really a system that makes the drainage system actually a destination in itself. So it's got enhanced planting, it's got lots of herbaceous species, and it basically makes it almost like a garden, the sud system itself into a garden, which also helps water percolate down into the soil, and it helps biodiversity. It makes sure that water's caught before it goes into the drainage systems and goes into the rivers and causes flooding downstream. And as I say, you can put benches next to them, and they're actually a destination in their own right, and you can make them really beautiful, and they're also serving multifunctional things with just being great.
I love that. I think like what's so interesting about that is you talked about the multifunction. Lucy, you touched on that as well. But it's like you have to have a SUD system in place anyway. Why wouldn't you make it beautiful and tick off all these extra boxes? It sounds like a win-win to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's. I wouldn't say it's a necessarily evil having a sustainable drainage system, but as you say, you've got to have it, so you may as well make it into an asset for the site.
I think also in really kind of dense urban areas in particular, often you're playing with a real lack of space, and it requires you to be a lot more imaginative on a site. And again, I think in the past there have been sort of sustainable drainage features that are just a kind of hole in the ground, and this is something that we hear coming through green infrastructure strategy work quite a lot, is that's something that's really frustrating people, because if you've got to put that there, you can really get a lot of your assets and a lot of what you need to do in green infrastructure terms in one space, because we have to be imaginative with space, because sometimes there's not an awful lot to play with. It's also where, like Alex said, green roofs and green walls come in as well.
Yeah, let's talk about the green roof aspect. Alex, what are green roofs and how can we be using them?
So a green roof is sort of exactly what it says on the tin, really. A green roof is a roof that's designed to be able to take plant species. And there's different types of green roofs. There's sort of intensive green roofs, which are the more used, that they've got a recreational side of things, so they're more used as amenity space. They tend to have a deeper substrate, and you can use deeper rooted plants. And then there's extensive green roofs, which is more of your sedum mat type things, which both of them are very valuable in their own right. Extensive tend to be used more on larger developments and roofs that are harder to get to, just because they take less maintenance, where intensive tends to be you see quite a lot of them on multi-storey car parks and things like this. And there's also there's biodiverse roofs, which are roofs specifically designed to enhance biodiversity. And there's also something called a brown roof, which is it's basically green roof that nobody's planted. So you put the substrate on there. So you put locally won topsoil and things like this, and stones, pebbles, rocks, and bits of wood. And basically, nature does its own thing, and you get a semi-natural ecosystem. And because you've got little areas of bare ground, you get it's great for burrowing insects and invertebrates, and it's really good for biodiversity basically, and it's relatively cheap because you don't have to do the planting.
Yeah, or weeding from what it sounds like, because it's just like,
Yeah.
it's nature doing this. I'm not lazy. Lucy, you mentioned green walls, living walls, and things like that, how they're another
Yeah.
way of approaching that. Anything else you'd like to say about green living walls?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of them hanging around in sort of Manchester city centre where I am now, and I know it's something that people are often quite keen on. People love a green wall, a living wall. I'm not the landscape architect, but I understand that they're quite high maintenance, but they're a really big kind of feature piece, and and that's the thing, I guess, with something like green walls, particularly in urban areas. But just as Alex was saying, around these kind of wonderful, intensive green roofs, is that they're not just things that, yes, we do need them because we're faced with a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis, but they also make schemes really good because people really are drawn to these things. They really like being around these kind of features. If you look kind of the last week or so at the Mayfield site in Manchester city centre, they've been daylighting the River Medlock. It's not just a charitable thing, right? It's really nice to daylight rivers and restore some of the nature that's in them because we have to do that. We have to kind of allow nature to recover, but it's seen as an incredibly important draw for people to come into that park, to invest there. These are, again, they can make a scheme really, really valuable and really add something to those schemes as well. So again, it's that link between addressing these challenges, but also doing really good placemaking at the same time. And they absolutely kind of fit together.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm a sucker for a green living wall and a green roof. I'm just like, oh wow, look at nature, it's taking over. It's so cool. Okay, so Alex, one thing we haven't touched base on, trees.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of trees. It's one
Good
of the
job.
reasons why I decided to become a landscape architect, really. Yeah, so I suppose I was sort of going the notion, if in doubt, plant a tree, because they're marvelous things. And however, first, if you've got a site, the first thing I'd say is make sure you make best use of what you've already got. As mature trees on site do a far better job at the ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration and carbon storage than newly planted trees, because basically there's a 40-50 year lag between planting a new tree and compared to a mature tree in terms of what you can do for reducing and mitigating climate change, impacts of climate change. But in terms of what trees can actually do for a site, I mean, there's a whole plethora of different things, in terms of biodiversity, shelter, in terms of reducing the urban heat island effect, and also obstructing the flow of water so it doesn't go into the drainage system quite so quick. And just the aesthetics of the things, it's far nicer to look out onto a tree than it is to look out onto a car park or something like that, which is kind of goes without saying. But also you've got to remember that I do say, if in doubt, plant a tree. However, it's also right tree, right place. I seem to be full of phrases, but you've got to make sure that if you have got a scheme, you select the correct tree for the that sort of microclimate. And if it's in a wind tunnel, you've got to be careful there because trees can die of drought. And all trees basically need air, water, and space for the root systems. So you've got to have that. And there's more ingenious ways in order to provide that, but you've got to have those three things. It's quite simple things, but you've got to have those three things in order for trees to survive. And there's nothing sadder than to see a sort of a street tree that's dying just because it's been paved right up to the trunk and it's just not got the space to breathe and grow. So yeah, it's very important to plant trees, but at the same time you've got to make sure that you're doing it correctly and you get the experts involved basically.
And that kind of makes me think, we've talked about green roofs, talked about rain gardens, trees. All of these things require upkeep, right? Like you just can't let them go and do their own thing. Like you have to, water them and care for them, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's maintenance of green blue infrastructure is vital. What I was going back to what I was saying about if you've got a mature tree on your site already, you should be maintaining that tree, making sure that tree is healthy and living, because that'll provide far more climate change mitigation than a load of new trees. In the first 40 years, basically, of those trees' life. And the same thing with things like green roofs and green walls. You've got to maintain them as well, because if they're left to dry out, that can cause a fire hazard and things like this. So especially with climate change, with potentially hotter, drier, longer periods of hotter, drier weather, you've got to be careful that you're not actually forming a fire hazard in implementing these types of designs.
So it's like go all out for green infrastructure, but do remember you do need to factor in maintenance and have, those plans in place. Would you say that's about right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we spend a lot of time racking our brains around maintenance when it comes to green infrastructure, because often the sort of capital funding is available through various funding streams, at a town scale, for example, a local authority scale, can identify some kind of funding to implement these things. But the maintenance is often what kind of slips through the net a little bit. And while there's no sort of silver bullet, it is about looking across that range of things that you could implement, so of assets that you could implement. So some of them are more capital and maintenance intensive than others. Wildflower, we're seeing again on a kind of local authority level. I'm a strategic planner, so I work a lot on a strategic scale. But you might have seen around a lot of road verges being filled with wildflowers. They can actually, over the longer term, create cost savings in terms of green infrastructure. So we can't put wildflower everywhere, but there are certain assets that require less maintenance that are more kind of quick wins. So it's about thinking creatively, and it's about, I think, whether it's a scheme or on a wider strategic level, getting the landscape architects around the table sort of at those initial conversations and talking about maintenance at those initial conversations, rather than it being an add-on at the end, because you can design in lower maintenance landscapes at whatever scale you're working at, but it needs to be a part of that first conversation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like if you bring in specialists early on, you can make sure you're making the right tree planting decisions and you're not, putting a tree that won't survive in that environment.
I think there's also a change in attitude when it comes to maintenance as well, especially cutting grass. It's still seen sometimes that long grass is the council or the local authority not upkeeping or maintenance, but actually that long grass is providing far more biodiversity than just shortcut grass that's really short, and it's there's not as many species in it. So yeah, it's kind of sort of an attitude change really towards that.
Yeah, I think we need that attitude change in America, the land of lawns, the tiny grasses. I remember having to cut them if they got like over an inch.
Yeah. I think we're still still sort of moving on from that manicured lawn approach here as well. But you do see things popping up gradually, and some kind of interpretation information boards, where that happens. It's a really good opportunity for people of all ages to learn about what wildflowers bring, to learn about pollinators. If you communicate to people and explain it to people, then they're more likely to understand. I think it is, slow progress, but it is happening. Yeah.
It's exciting stuff. And I think now let's zoom out, because we've already talked a little bit about local authorities. Now I'm in the position of being a local authority. What can I do to be implementing green infrastructure?
Well, as I say, I'm a strategic planner, so I'm the kind of zooming out kind of expert. We work with a lot of we particularly work with a lot of local authorities and kind of regional authorities as well on green infrastructure work. And I guess the point is, the reason that strategic scale is really important is that even if you have a bunch of sites scattered across a particular town, for example, that are really trend-setting, really nature-rich, have all the assets that Alex has talked about. They're full of rain gardens and trees. You certainly can't address the challenges that we're looking at through isolated sites. And it goes back to that definition that we talked about at the beginning of green infrastructure as a network. You need that connectivity between them and between those sites, and you need green corridors and blue corridors. So you need to have a really holistic view of how the network as a whole is working at a certain spatial scale. And that's particularly important for anything that addresses the biodiversity crisis. So we work closely with a lot of our ecologists on thinking about the nature recovery network, which is a term that's coming up a lot with the new environment bill. So we're having to map out and sort of implement a nature recovery network across the country and at local authority level. And wildlife really needs those kind of unbroken corridors of habitat so that they can move around, and particularly so they become more resilient to climate change. So as the climate changes, that connectivity becomes even more important. But for humans too, we also need kind of unbroken greenways for walking and cycling. If you have a big gap in them, people won't walk, they won't cycle. If you don't have those environments that encourage that, we can't get that modal shift away from cars to walking and cycling. So really, it's just about those connections. And that has to be sort of data and evidence led. There has to be someone mapping out that network and saying, right, in this particular place, that's the this is the priority, and this is where the funding needs to be directed to. And also so that if you have a scheme, you can look beyond that red line boundary and think, right, what is the wider context that I'm sitting in? Am I near a particularly important green corridor or a blue corridor? And how can I contribute to that, to sort of tick those boxes. Tick those boxes is a terrible term to use in terms of that, but they know what's expected of them. A lot of that is through really good green and blue infrastructure strategic work. So what that does at a local authority level, for example, it'll be looking at the challenges that are specific to that place and prioritizing what are the best ways to kind of enhance that network. So again, really good green infrastructure strategies, they'll provide certainty to everyone over what is needed, and that'll be different in each place. We've been working in Wirral quite a lot recently, around what their green infrastructure network should do. It's a really sensitive place in terms of the environment because of the coastal environment, but there's also a lot of change that's going on there. So in the wider Birkenhead area, there's a lot of change and a lot of regeneration going on. So we just need to make sure that regeneration is landscape led, so they can look at a map somewhere that's set out, right, these are our priorities for the green infrastructure network, priority corridors, and that should be the starting point for that development that's going to happen. So yeah, and I think also really good green infrastructure work should feed into design coding. Again, there's a real emphasis on design coding as part of these new rather vague planning reforms at the moment, but that's about setting out upfront at either a scheme level or a local authority level what the design requirements and the design standards should be that should be reached. And that's not about the intricacies of the architecture. It's actually a much more about how things are laid out, and a lot of it is going to be about climate resilience, about green infrastructure networks, about green and blue assets. So I think really good green infrastructure work feeds into that design coding as well, and really tells people what they need to provide. Whoever those actors are that are involved in development, need to know what the priorities are, so they can respond to that. So at the strategic scale, I think it's really important that someone has that big picture and is mapping it out and making it really easy to understand for all the different actors to take part in.
Yeah, Lucy, is there a scheme or a local authority that you think is just really nailing it, and like this is kind of the thing we should be looking towards as a great example of how to do this right?
There's a few that we've worked with that have been, really impressively kind of ambitious. Certainly, a lot of the things that are going on in Greater Cambridge, there's an awful lot of energy around Greater Cambridge that's doing that. But kind of further up here, I kind of pick up. There was a discussion on a Place Northwest panel last week about what Oldham Council is doing in terms of their town centre regeneration, because obviously that's a big theme in terms of town centre regeneration coming up. And I think that's a really important thing that's also needs to be green infrastructure led and landscape led. And one thing I sort of said last week, and I'll say again, is that it's interesting that in for example, 20 years ago, the approach to regeneration might have been, right, let's get a shopping centre in the middle of this town centre and allow regeneration to flow from that. That is your catalyst. But now we're living in a very, very different context. We're living in the context of a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency, but also one where we've got a slightly different approach to placemaking, and we're starting to see the fruits of that. So, for instance, what Oldham are doing, and it's a theme that's coming up in a few of the more progressive kind of local authorities across the country, is really taking a proactive view to how their town centre looks. And Oldham, for example, are creating a linear park right through the centre of the town centre to draw people in with the green rather than just the shops, again, responding to some of the things that are happening on high streets. But also they're creating 160 hectares of urban farm, basically right on the edge of Oldham, linking that into residential areas, and creating a real asset that helps people right from the town centre, be in this kind of nature-rich space. And it's a really bold, ambitious vision to put forward, and it sets out exactly what needs to be leading the regeneration in that area. And I think that's a really good example that I've heard of. Everyone then who's investing in Oldham knows what the vision is, what to get on board with. And also just it really feeds on a lot of the things that I think we've been realizing since the COVID-19 pandemic and since lockdown, is that real return to an appreciation of what people like doing. People didn't necessarily just miss, going to the shops and going to Debenhams. They actually, they went out to green spaces. They started growing things in allotments. There was a huge explosion in demand for allotments and for growing space. So why can't we kind of take some of those gaps in the high street and in town centres and fill it with that kind of thing? Because we're in 2021 now, we're not in the 1990s. And so I really like seeing progressive visions like that happening at the local authority level.
And I love what you had to say about COVID too, because I feel like when we were in lockdown, we treasured our green spaces so much because it was like the one chance you got to go outside and, explore and see something outside your four walls. And it meant so much to me personally. And I also know that combined with like all the news reports that are coming out now, they're just making us and forcing us to be aware of how troubling the climate change issue really is, and we can't ignore it anymore. I feel like now is the time to really invest in green space, and people want to, they're interested in it.
Absolutely. I think the conversation has, shifted a little bit, like you say, the way people talk about green space, and also the recognition of deficits in green space, and how that plays out across different socioeconomic groups. So there's a really strong correlation that we often find when we're doing green infrastructure work between areas of socioeconomic deprivation and lack of access to green space. So really looking at it not just from a climate change view, but also from a health and well-being point of view. And kind of seeing green spaces and blue spaces as a health asset. There's bags and bags of research coming out about how important that is. I think Alex touched on it earlier. How important those spaces are for kind of health and well-being.
Yeah. So local authorities can be helping out by, looking at these wider networks, establishing the corridors, really building on them, and having a clear design codes, but also like clear messaging as to what they want and what they're pushing for, as well as making sure they consider the entire community and not just necessarily the middle class neighborhoods and whatnot. Lucy, is there anything else like as a local authority we should be doing for green infrastructure?
I guess again, as a local authority, you should be setting out a vision. So, that there are sort of certain funding streams coming in. The funding of this, at a strategic scale as well as a site scale is very difficult, because what we're seeing at kind of that national policy level isn't necessarily feeding through into policy action and funding for local authorities. So they're having to really kind of, and some of them are doing a fabulous job at sort of piecing together different funding opportunities. So whether that's through grant funding, things like lottery funding, or some things coming through the town funds and high street regeneration, and using those for kind of green infrastructure work. But it's a challenge. People having to be really innovative about how these things are funded, how these things are maintained. I think the biggest challenge really in all this from a local authority perspective, and what we see, and why it's so amazing when you see local authorities come up with really bold visions, is that the resourcing of local authorities is really currently really causes a barrier to being able to do this. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to go into setting out that vision, doing that mapping, and bringing everything together. And particularly when it comes to things like design coding and things that are being asked up front of local authorities, without a real step change in the funding and the upskilling of planning departments, but also design departments, and getting design expertise in local authorities, it's going to be incredibly challenging to deliver all of this. I think I was reading, for those of us kind of cool kids who were reading the Planner magazine last week in their evenings, there was a real call for, there was a issue focused on climate change, and it was really calling for planning, but include kind of design as part of that, being a really essential public service and being seen very differently. There's a lot that's being asked of planning, and planners have an incredibly important role to play in addressing climate change, but they need a lot more upskilling and funding of these departments in local authorities. They've been really strained for the last 10 years, and I think none of this can be achieved without getting them more resources.
Yeah. All right. So, kind of like thinking about everything we've talked about today, how are we feeling about the status of green infrastructure in UK schemes? Are we using it the right way? Are we missing opportunities? Are we feeling optimistic about meeting our climate change goals? Alex, I'm going to ask you to take lead on this one.
I think we've got got quite a lot to go. We've got a way to go before we're anywhere near meeting our climate change targets and ambitions. But I think I've got hope because, as we alluded to, I think there's much more appreciation now of green spaces and green infrastructure and blue infrastructure as well. And just seeing sort of, I mean, it might be slightly trite, but looking just on the TV, the amount of gardening programs are on, it's just, I think people are really appreciating that access to green space and to have green assets within a development scheme adds real value. And it's a real asset in terms of even just the economics of the scheme. And in order to make all the hard work of doing it in your site, make the most benefit out of that, these sites have got to be connected. So yeah, I can see we're on the right track, but we've got a long way to go. It feels as if attitudes are changing towards it, and people are taking the climate and ecological emergency seriously, whereas 10 years ago it might have just been a box ticking exercise and seen as a constraint on development. But now hopefully people are seeing it can be an advantage to a development.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult question to answer when you work in kind of the sector we work in. But I'd really kind of echo what Alex was saying. Really, you can't really skirt over the gravity and the scale of the challenge, and we are so far behind where we need to be for a number of reasons. When you're reading kind of the latest IPCC report on the impacts and things, but I think what's really important is we've got to let that IPCC report catalyze us rather than paralyze us, which is because it's very easy to be paralyzed by these things. But there are really good things going on. They might be isolated and they might not be being scaled up the way they need to be. But again, when you work in this area, we've been sort of banging this drum for an awful long time at LUC since the 1960s, not personally, obviously. But those conversations are starting to change. Currently, I think it tends to be a few really ambitious local authorities and ambitious developers really trying to set a standard. And to be honest, the kind of people that come to us to do that tend to be the people who are really trying to raise the bar, and that is happening. We're very busy, so people are coming to us. But I think it needs to be more sort of mainstream, so it needs to be raising the bar across all the development that's delivered and all of the planning that happens. It basically needs a massive scaling up. As I mentioned before, it requires more resourcing for local authorities, but there is kind of a positive way of looking at this. It's a huge challenge, but when we think about climate change, I think we often think about a series of sort of technical constraints. So we think about kind of EV chargers, we think about technical solutions, tweaking things, what we can do. And actually, we can look at it much more broadly and much more holistically than that. So it's some of the themes that we kind of picked up on today. People love living in these places. Some of the things that are good for climate change also make for brilliant places, things that really help us tackle the health crisis. And that's a real opportunity. We can tackle many of these things at once. I think the final thing I'd say is that we really need to start focusing on resilience and resilient places. So with climate change, you've got mitigation. We absolutely have to focus on that. Decarbonisation of the economy, drawing down carbon into woodlands where we can, reducing our carbon emissions. But the reality is that the effects are absolutely already with us. So that means that all of our developments and all of our planning needs to be carbon resilient. It needs to soak up some of that flood water. It needs to provide really good urban heating. Alex was talking about the role of trees in combating the urban heat island effect. We really need to tackle those two things at once. The mitigation isn't enough. We now sort of need to adapt. I know it's really difficult sometimes to imagine the northwest of England being an urban heat island, but that we are heating, and we're certainly going to get a lot of flooding. But again, the kind of positive side of that is the way that you can absorb flooding are things like I don't know whether you've ever heard of West Gorton Community Park in the east of Manchester. It's a park where when there's no rain, it's a park with certain landscaping. When there's a lot of rain, it was in a flood risk area. It becomes essentially a wetland with great biodiversity value, but also a fabulous place for kind of children to play and people to sort of hang out. That's what we've got to do. We've got to absorb floodwater, but let's do it in a way that's kind of enriching and that makes our places nicer places to live rather than just a kind of engineered solution. So kind of that's, I guess, where I'd leave it. I think, the last thing I'd say is that with kind of whether you're a developer or a local authority, I think however ambitious you're being, you're probably not being ambitious enough when it comes to green and blue infrastructure and climate change. There's a lot more to be done. There's really kind of rich, brilliant examples and solutions to this, but we need more of them.
Yeah. I will say normally I end these by recapping what we've just spoken about, but I think Lucy, you just did that for me. But to kind of like chime in a little bit and just, add some more specifics to our conversation, we talked about how developers can be using green infrastructure on their individual sites. That's things like having rain gardens, sponge landscapes, green roofs, planting trees. When in doubt, plant a tree, but plant the right tree in the right area. Right? Gotcha, Alex. And then, zooming out as like a local authority, we really need to be looking at the networks and corridors that already exist, but also how we can be growing them and expanding them. We need to be ambitious and dream big. And we also need to have funding in place to support all of this and a clear message that this is our goals and our ambitions. So, that was a lot. This is a good chat. I like it.
Green infrastructure in a nutshell.
Yeah, exactly. This is all you need to hear about it. Alex, Lucy, thank you guys so much for joining me today. Hope you enjoyed yourselves.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, very much so.
All right. And thank you, the listener, for joining us today on the Place Northwest podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about LUC and what they can do to make your project greener, you can head over to landuse.co.uk to learn all about what they're up to. Can't get enough about sustainability? You're in luck because this was just one episode in our COP26 podcast series. That's a series of episodes that we're releasing in the lead up to COP26 Climate Change Conference. Don't miss a single one. You can subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, or Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Julia Hatmaker. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.